Welcome. Step into our world of fear. Let's journey together in pursuit of mysterious tales and dark secrets. Are you ready? Because on this channel, the suspense never ends.
In the middle of a forest, though I'd go camping, hiking, and hunting all the time. My younger brother lived just a couple hours north, and we'd often do these sort of things together. We have planned on going out hunting one last time before winter season began. Whenever I'd go for long trips, I'd tell my neighbors so that they could watch my house and everything. So on Monday evening I let them know that I was leaving, and the following morning I packed up my bag and drove further north. It was toward the end of fall, so obviously it was fairly cold, breezy, and snowy. I only planned on being away for a couple days, though, as my brother, and I just wanted to go hunting for a day or two. About halfway there, snow began falling. Not unusual in any way, but after a few more minutes down the road, the snow began to pick up more and more, piled on the small narrow road. My car wasn't a piece of junk or anything, but also wasn't a huge snowplow type truck. It was just a regular few-year-old pickup truck that was reliable in all normal conditions. But I was about 20 minutes away when unfortunately the layer of snow slid under my tires, causing the truck to land on the side of the road. In several inches of snow, it wasn't a very chaotic crash, but I knew pretty much right away that this wasn't going to be an easy hole to dig myself out of. Of course, I quickly tried a few times to simply drive the truck out, but it wasn't moving. The tires were spinning with no traction at all, so I put on my heavy jacket and hopped out to see what I could do. The road was slightly uphill, which made the situation even worse, not to mention that the snow was still pouring down. After a quick circle around my truck, I knew there was no way for me to get this out alone. I got back inside and weighed my options. I had no service, so calling my brother for help wouldn't work, but I sent a text anyway in hopes that it may somehow end up being sent. The only two options I really had were to either stay and hope that someone happens to drive by and help, or get out and walk to my brother's town, which would take about 2 to 3 hours. I knew this road was practically unused, and the chances of someone driving by and getting out to help were slim at best. The sun was still out, and I was worried that if I didn't do something soon, then I could be stuck in the middle of the vast empty forest during a freezing night. So I decided to walk. I grabbed my hunting rifle along with my pistol holstered to my waist and emptied my bag of everything that I didn't need for the walk. All I had to do was follow the road, so getting lost wasn't too much of a worry of mine, but getting stranded in the cold was. The snow on the road wasn't too thick yet, and after 30 minutes of walking, the fall began to lighten. The only thing I really thought about while walking was how ridiculous the situation was and how unlucky I had been. But this inconvenience soon took a darker turn. As I followed the road around the curve, I noticed a large tree had fallen over the road. As I got closer, I could tell that the stump of the tree was on the side of the road that I was walking on. Approaching it, I was shocked to see how clean the cut was. It had clearly been purposefully cut down with an axe or a saw. I immediately looked around nervously into the snowy forest around me. There had to be some malicious intent behind this. I was almost sure of it, but how malicious I didn't know. It could have just been some sick joke forcing cars to turn around, or it could be an attempt to rob people, or even worse, I also didn't know if this was done recently or not. The road was barely used, but it surely would have been removed after a couple days. I chose to continue walking around and almost jogging to put my distance between me and the possible trap, but I was too late. "Hey, hold up there," a man yelling from behind me asked me to wait. I turned, seeing what looked like two hunters standing right by the fallen tree. They had long rifles strapped to their shoulders and were waving their hands as if to get my attention. Being maybe 100 feet away, I stood in place thinking of what to do. One of the men yelled again, asking for help moving the tree. At this point, though, I was starting to add things up. Where were they when I was looking around? They had to have been hiding, not to mention I never passed a car, so why would they need help? I turned, picking up my pace and ignoring their calls. They continued shouting for a whole minute before their voices faded away through the falling snow. I eventually made it safely to my brother's house, and we went to the nearest police station to report the fallen tree, and the strange hunters. An officer also came with us the following day to help retrieve my truck. Unfortunately, the windows had been shattered, and my vehicle was completely looted of everything. After having these past years to think about the ordeal, I think I have a pretty good idea of what happened. The most obvious part is that those men had likely cut the tree down on the road so that they could rob, or maybe even do worse to those who came down the isolated road. My guess is that they were probably hiding deep in the forest, listening for the sound of a car coming towards them, and that's when they would know to come out and make their move. That being said, I actually feel really lucky that I had gotten stuck on the side of the road and was forced to walk, because that had likely saved me from an even more terrifying and dangerous encounter. I grew up in a town located in a fairly rural section of our country, but during the time I was growing up there were only a few pockets of woodland left due to fast urbanization, and those too were bordered by housing complexes. I despised walking through those trees because they always gave me a weird feeling, but the shortest path from our street to pretty much anywhere was to take a path that led from the end of the street around the back of the houses and through the woods. When I used to cross this trail, my heart would race the entire time, but I always had to go through the woods when my mother sent me to the store to pick something up, or when I had to walk to school. My older brother used to constantly tell me that the woods were haunted by spirits, because he knew how frightened I was of them in the winter when it was nearly dark. When we get home from school, larger kids would lurk behind the trees to frighten the younger ones and demand any money, or occasionally even their cell phones. Being a smaller female, this was even more scary. Since I'm an adult now, I was no longer afraid of the woods. When I went back to my hometown last year, few days, and it began snowing pretty heavily, my mom, being the kind woman that she is, called our elderly neighbor and informed her that she could walk her dog so that she wouldn't have to take the risk of tripping on the slippery pavement. This was a regular good deed that my mom would do for the neighbor. Of course, though, I told my mom I could do it for her, as I knew she didn't like the cold and I wanted to do something nice for her. While I was there, I was strolling with a Labrador dog along the same path that we went through the woods. Since it doesn't snow very often where I currently reside, I took my recently purchased DSLR camera with me to capture the view. Toward the beginning of the path, I stopped to take a quick picture. As I tried to frame the camera, a scream in the distance made me jump. It just sounded like kids playing around though, so I continued about my business. Although I was thoroughly enjoying the stroll, I started to grow a little chilly, and I didn't want to overwork the neighbor's dog, so I was gonna turn around when I heard something scurrying towards us. We were briefly out of sight, partially in the woods, and it sounded like someone was hurrying along the main path. I'm not sure why the idea to hide came to me, but it was a gut instinct. So that's exactly what I did. I paused briefly before stepping completely off of the path and hiding amid the shrubs and trees. I suppose I was also concerned that if a thief noticed my camera, he could think that I was an easy target. The dog hesitated when I tugged on its leash, but then it quickly followed me into the bushes just in time as a person approached on the path just a few feet away. I knelt down and put my head on the Labrador's head. I didn't really get a close look at him, but I could make out that he was a tall man wearing a black beanie and a brown jacket, who was going hastily. He looked a little nervous too, looking all around frantically, and had both of his hands and fists. Thank goodness the dog stayed calm as the man left the dog, and I re-entered the trail once he had vanished from view, and I made the decision to capture a few more photos before we went back home. When we were on our way back, a noisy helicopter disrupted the total silence. It wasn't until we were out of the trees and behind the houses that I could clearly see it. There I had noticed a police aircraft circling some nearby trees. Without incident, I brought the dog back to my mother's elderly neighbor. I didn't give the walk any thoughts until the next morning when my mother turned on the morning news station. It was a local station, and their top breaking news was that the police were looking for a man who had stabbed two ladies on a deserted pathway last night, one of whom had survived the route they had outlined connected with the forest I had been strolling in. The suspect was described as being tall and sporting a black cap along with a dark jacket. That's when I realized I had seen a murderer running away from his crime site, and it was only my gut instinct along with my concern about my camera that had prevented me from almost being stabbed in the midst of the forest. My parents never let me go camping as a kid. Even when I turned 18, they begged me not to go. They never told me why when I was younger, but they finally told me the story. Apparently, when my parents were still dating, they decided to go camping in the Upper Peninsula. My mom's uncle owned some cabins up there, but my dad said staying in cabins didn't count as real camping, so they brought a tent and some normal camping gear. But my mom still wanted to stay close to the cabins just in case. After a quick walk around the cabins, they went down a trail that led to a small lake, and from there they went off trail enough so that they couldn't hear or be bothered by anyone, but also not so far that they'd get lost. My parents set up camp and swam in the lake. Overall, they had a really good day. On the way back to their tent, however, they saw a huge black mass in the trees. They stopped and watched it quietly. It was a bear just roaming, minding its own business. It turned around to look at my parents, stared at them for a while, and went back to walking around. My dad says it was pretty freaky to see one in real life, and this thing was huge, like at least 400 pounds. My parents walked past while still looking back to make sure it wasn't going to do anything, and the bear kept looking back at them too, staring for short periods of time, which I guess isn't entirely normal, but also not that weird either. Night came around, and my dad made a fire and cooked some dinner. He told me this was where things started to take a turn later that night. While they were talking inside of their tent, they heard movement outside. They sat there quietly trying to listen to what it could be. The footsteps sounded big and not like any humans. It got closer and closer until they heard the metal cooking pot fall to the ground outside, making a large bang followed by rustling of plastic. It then sounded like it began trying to eat the leftovers inside the cooking pot. Before knocking it away, low grumbles filled the silence, and the heavy footsteps got closer to the tent. Big sniffs went from the bottom of the tent to the middle, where they stopped for a moment. The big animal, which my parents presumed was the bear from earlier, loudly exhaled on the tent. You could see the imprint of the bear's nose as it began sniffing again. It then began to push its massive paw against the thin plastic as if to test what it was. My parents stayed dead silent the entire time. No clue of what to do in this situation. It moved around to the front, where the zipper was sniffing the ground at the very bottom, where there was a small opening in the zipper. Then another short moment of silence before it aggressively struck the tent with its paw, smashing into the top of it, causing the plastic to cave in. Thankfully, it seemed to just be another test, though, as they could hear it jump backwards as the tent popped right back into shape. Afterwards, the massive bear could be heard walking around the campsite for a few more minutes before hurrying off into the woods. They stayed up for the rest of the night and left at dawn. My dad talked about how lucky they were that the bear didn't actually attack the tent, because it could have easily clawed its way in if it wasn't so nervous. Those kinds of bears don't usually attack people, so they aren't too sure what it was trying to do. But either way, it was terrifying. After hearing about that encounter, I never even wanted to go camping. Thank you.